Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling incidents in Taney County, Missouri's history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. What locations and times of day or night these recorded stories reach are of interest to us. By the time Sheriff Nathaniel Kenny arrived on that chilly November morning in 1846, the wagon tracks leading to the Crenshaw homestead were all but vanished. The small log cabin stood calmly against the naked oak trees on the Ozark hillside, its grass turning brown with frost. No one has reported seeing any Crenshaw family members for 19 days, according to county documents. For the third week in a row, Thomas Crenshaw forgot to pick up a crucial letter from his sister in Kentucky, and it was the postmaster in the nearby village of Forsyth who eventually called the police. Benjamin Lacey, the assistant to the postmaster, remembered in a statement recorded in 1867 that the peculiar thing wasn't that the Crenshaws were gone. Folks sometimes disappeared in those parts. The hills swallowed people. But it was the way Thomas had been acting in the weeks prior, nervous-like, checking his shoulder every few minutes, and there was that strange mark on his neck that he kept hiding with his collar. The Crenshaw farm was located in a tiny valley close to what is now Bull Creek, some 7 miles northeast of the county seat of Forsyth. 3 years prior, the family had come from Virginia, where they had bought 80 acres of land from a retired trapper. According to all accounts, Thomas Crenshaw, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children, infant Clara, Daniel, 14, and Abigail, 17, were unremarkable settlers. Thomas sold his crafts in Springfield on occasion while working as a cobbler. Margaret was known to exchange preserves with nearby farms and kept a small vegetable garden. They kept to themselves, but that wasn't unusual for these parts, wrote Reverend William Stone of the Forsyth Methodist Church in a December 1846 parish report. Margaret attended service irregularly, always without her husband. The children appeared well behaved, though remarkably quiet. I recall only once hearing the eldest girl speak, and that was to decline communion. One of the most unsettling mysteries in Ozark history would be built upon what Sheriff Kenny found at the Crenshaw property that November morning. In the autumn breeze, the cabin door creaked softly as it stood slightly open. The hearth was cold with ashes inside, indicating that there had not been a fire for at least 2 weeks. On the table, a partially cooked dish consisting of cornbread, beans, and what looked like venison stew was decomposing. Although the family only had 5 members, according to county records, 5 plates had been laid out. The condition of the family's belongings was the most odd. They continued to fold their clothes in trunks. Margaret's beloved silver hairbrush, which was said to have been her mother's wedding present, was still resting on the bedside table. Thomas's cobbling implements were still neatly arranged on his desk. A section of Proverbs, highlighted in what seemed like freshly applied ink, read, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." The family Bible was open on a little table. No family in these parts would voluntarily leave behind such possessions, according to the sheriff's report, particularly not their Bible. Something caused the Crenshaws to depart with great haste, or they met with foul play. Few hints were found during the first study. With one exception, Jeremiah Branson, whose property bordered the Crenshaw land to the west, claimed to have heard a woman's wailing echoing through the hills about 2 weeks prior to the discovery of the abandoned homestead. Neighbors, the closest of whom lived almost 3 miles away, reported nothing out of the ordinary. "Thought it was a mountain lion at first," Branson said, "but no cat cries quite like a woman in despair." The finding that the family's lone horse was still in the tiny stable behind the cabin added even more distress to the absence. The fact that the animal was alive but underweight indicated that someone had at least made an effort to provide it some basic care before leaving. It was still unclear how the family could have made such a long journey without their horse. Who would do business with the seemingly normal Crenshaw family? That was the most plausible explanation, which was that they had been picked up by someone who had another way to get around. The barn and other outlying buildings on the site were also part of Sheriff Kenny's investigation. He pointed out a number of oddities in his formal report, which was sent to the Taney County Clerk on the 27th of November, 1846. The family's cow appears to have been slaughtered approximately 2 weeks prior, though in a manner inconsistent with butchering for consumption. The carcass was found in the Northfield, its bones arranged in an unusual configuration. Dr. Reed, who accompanied our party, could offer no explanation for the pattern. The investigation continues with, in the small cobbler's workshop, adjacent to the main cabin, we discovered several leather pieces that Mr. Crenshaw appeared to have been working on prior to his disappearance. The designs are unusual, not typical shoe or boot patterns, but rather elongated shapes resembling gloves or masks. Mr. Fletcher, the tanner from Forsyth, who identified the materials, expressed puzzlement at their purpose. There were intermittent searches in the nearby wilderness during the winter of 1846 to 47. There was no evidence of the missing family, and no bodies were found. The case had cooled by spring, and the county finally acquired the land because of unpaid taxes. Without the discovery revealed 13 years later by Hunter Elijah Simmons, who took refuge in the deserted Crenshaw cabin during an unanticipated storm, the mystery may have stayed hidden in obscurity. Simmons sought sanctuary in the dilapidated building, which had been deserted since the abduction, in the spring of 1859. He was gathering firewood when he saw that one of the floors by the fireplace appeared to be loose. He lifted it and found a little tin box with a leather-bound journal inside. On the inner cover, the name Margaret Crenshaw was written. The journal, which is currently housed in the Missouri State Historical Society's Historical Archives in Columbia, has entries from January 1845 to November 1846, which is just 3 days before the family is thought to have vanished. Though the specifics of their problems are unclear, the last entries show a household in quiet distress. Margaret wrote, "Thomas returned from the ridge today with mud on his boots that wasn't from our lands, on the 30th of October 1846. He speaks little now, eating in silence before retreating to the shed where I am forbidden to enter. Abigail watches him through the window. She knows something. The child has not been right since she began accompanying her father on his hunting trips. Daniel grows more withdrawn. Only little Clara remains untouched by the shadow that has fallen over this house. Margaret is shown in earlier journal entries as a woman who is growing more and more alone in her own house. A March 1846 entry states, "Spring brings no joy this year." Thomas insists we decline all invitations to gatherings in town. He claims the journey is too arduous for Clara, but I suspect other reasons. When the Miller family stopped to visit last Sunday, he hurried them away before I could even offer coffee. He watches the children constantly now, not with a father's love, but with something else in his eyes, something calculating. A particularly telling entry from July 1846 describes a situation that involved the oldest daughter. Found Abigail washing her hands in the creek today. The water around her had turned pink. When questioned, she claimed she had been picking berries, but there were no stains on her fingers. Later I discovered her dress hidden beneath her mattress, the hem caked with dried blood. When confronted, she stared through me, as if I weren't there, humming that strange melody Thomas taught the children last winter. I fear for her mind. The last entry in the journal, from November 3rd, is especially upsetting. I found the box today, hidden beneath Thomas's workbench. The contents cannot be described, must not be described. God forgive him. God forgive us all for coming to this cursed place. We are being watched, not by eyes of flesh, but by something that waits in the silence between thoughts. Thomas says it is nothing, but I have seen how he nails the window shut at night. Now he knows. We all know. It is almost time. In 1860, a brief but fresh investigation was triggered by the discovery of Margaret's journal. The property and its environs were searched by Jacob Mosley, the sheriff who had taken Nathaniel Kenny's place as he was retiring. His report on the 12th of April 1860 states that the search turned up very little useful information. The cabin has deteriorated significantly in the 14 years since the disappearance. Wildlife has claimed much of the structure. We discovered several small items of interest. A child's doll beneath the rotting floorboards, a man's pocket watch lodged between wall logs, and most curiously, a collection of small animal bones arranged in a circle in what appears to have been the children's sleeping area. Sarah Templeton, an elderly Forsyth resident who claimed to have known Margaret Crenshaw, was interviewed for Mosley's report. Mrs. Templeton states that approximately 1 month before the family's disappearance, Margaret came to her home in a state of agitation. According to Templeton, Margaret spoke of strange noises in their walls at night, like something scratching to get in. Margaret also allegedly expressed concern about her husband's increasingly erratic behavior, claiming he would stand motionless in the yard for hours after sunset, as if listening to voices only he could hear. It was impossible to spare resources for a 4-year-old disappearance when the country was on the verge of civil war. Once more, the matter lost its official interest and was reduced to a topic of local tradition and conjecture. Although there are no reliable accounts of supernatural activity, the abandoned Crenshaw property became known as a haunted spot among the local kids. Instead, the site was plagued by the persistent mystery about the family's fate. Like most of the Missouri Ozarks, Taney County saw tremendous unrest during the Civil War. Both Union and Confederate armies, along with sporadic guerrilla organizations, were active in the area. According to reports, after a battle near Bull Creek in 1863, the ancient Crenshaw cabin was used for a short time as a field hospital. The men refused to convalesce in the eastern room of the cabin. They report disturbing dreams when sleeping there, consistently describing children crying from within the walls. Union Army medical records from this period contain an odd comment from Assistant Surgeon Walter Hammond. Have relocated all patients to the main room to alleviate their distress, though I attribute this to fever and the psychological strain of combat rather than any supernatural cause. Not until 1934 did fresh evidence surface. About 5 miles from the old Crenshaw farm, workmen excavating for a new county road discovered a number of personal belongings hidden behind a giant oak tree. Among them were a cobbler's awl, a child's wooden toy with one arm missing, and a man's pocket watch with the initials TC etched on the casing. Most important was a sealed mason jar with a letter in it, written in a squinty, rushed hand. In an interview with the Branson Gazette on the 15th of September 1934, Foreman Clayton Hughes explained the discovery. "We were clearing that old oak when Johnson's axe hit something metal. At first, we thought we'd found a cache of Confederate gold," Hughes chuckled. "Instead, it was just an old jar with papers inside. Wouldn't have thought much of it, but the county historian got all excited when he saw that pocket watch, said it might be connected to some old disappearance case. The letter, which was sent on November 7, 1846, appears composed by Thomas Crenshaw himself. To whoever finds this, we are leaving tonight. There is no choice remaining to us. What dwells in the cave beyond Sampson's Ridge has taken notice of us. I believed I could protect my family by providing what it demanded. I was wrong. It wants more than blood and bone now." Margaret says she hears it calling to Clara in the night. "We go north, toward the territories. Do not follow. If you are reading this, the jar has been disturbed, and it will know. It always knows. May God have mercy on your soul, as I pray He will have on mine." Everett Phillips, the county historian who studied the items in 1934, pointed out a number of oddities. The pocket watch, while clearly belonging to someone with the initials TC, appears to have been deliberately damaged. The face has been scratched repeatedly with a sharp implement, obscuring the numerals. More curious is the position of the hands, which appear to have been frozen at 3:27 when the mechanism was forcibly stopped. Phillips additionally pointed out that the child's doll had odd marks. Carved into the wooden back of the doll's head is a series of symbols resembling no language I can identify. They appear to have been inscribed with a fine-pointed tool, possibly an awl, similar to the one found alongside it. The precision suggests they held significance to the carver, rather than being mere idle markings. The letter's reference to the cave beyond Sampson's Ridge created a topographical conundrum. No official map of Taney County showed a landmark with that name. On the other hand, Sampson's Ridge was a nickname given by early settlers to what is now Bull Creek Ridge, about 6 miles northeast of the Crenshaw property, according to local historian Emmett Davidson, who conducted interviews with senior citizens in the late 1950s. Additional background for the region was revealed by Davidson's study, which was published in a series of essays for the Ozark Historical Review between 1957 and 1959. Samson Ledbetter, an early trapper, is said to have survived a battle with 3 bears on the slopes of Samson's Ridge in 1822, hence the name, according to local legend. The significance of the ridge to the native populations that lived in the region before to European colonization, however, is more intriguing. According to Osage oral traditions gathered by anthropologist Victor Trilone in 1927, there was a place of bad dreams nearby where it was illegal for tribe members to camp or hunt. Davidson led a volunteer archaeological team to the region in the summer of 1961. On the northern slope of the ridge, the team discovered a narrow cave entrance that was partially hidden by vegetation, according to his field notes, which were published posthumously in the Ozark Historical Review in 1968. The opening is barely wide enough for a man to pass through sideways, Davidson stated. It extends approximately 30 feet into the hillside before opening into a chamber roughly 15 feet in diameter. The walls bear unusual markings, not native pictographs, but more recent carvings, geometric patterns, repeated symbols resembling elongated human figures without faces. In-depth drawings of these carvings may be found in Davidson's field notes. Based on weathering patterns and the initials TC appearing in some of the designs, Davidson estimated that these carvings were created in the middle of the 19th century. The symbols appear to radiate outward from a central point on the eastern wall, he stated. At the central location, we discovered a small natural alcove in the limestone, roughly at chest height. The alcove shows signs of modification. The edges have been carefully smoothed, suggesting human intervention. Most significant was Davidson's description of a small alcove at the rear of the chamber. Set into the natural shelf of limestone is what appears to be a collection of small objects, buttons, thimbles, a child's tooth, a brass locket containing a curl of dark hair. Most disturbing is the arrangement. The items form a precise circle. At the center lies a cobbler's knife, its blade darkened with what our team's physician believes to be dried blood. The age of these items is difficult to determine, but the style of the buttons and thimble is consistent with mid-19th century manufacture. Walter Harrison, a professor of geology at the University of Missouri, was part of the expedition team and observed the chamber's unusual acoustic characteristics. Harrison's input to Davidson's report stated that ordinary conversation becomes almost inaudible when standing in the center of the space, directly before the alcove. However, sounds from outside the cave, the wind in the trees, distant animal calls become strangely amplified. The effect is disorienting, creating the impression that the forest is somehow inside the chamber with you. I can only attribute this to some unusual configuration of the limestone formations, though I have never encountered it in 30 years of cave exploration. These items were gathered by Davidson's expedition for more research. However, the automobile transporting the gathered goods was involved in a single-car collision on a distant section of roadway on the way back to Springfield. The container with the cave treasures was apparently flung from the vehicle and lost in the thick underbrush, but Davidson survived with only minor injuries. The objects were never found, even after a thorough search. The Missouri State Highway Patrol reported the collision on the 17th of July, 1961, stating that it happened on Highway 165, some 12 miles north of Branson. Davidson's vehicle left the road at approximately 11:45 p.m., striking a tree on the eastern shoulder. The report states, driver claims to have swerved to avoid a figure standing in the roadway. No evidence of pedestrian found at scene. Driver exhibited signs of shock but no significant physical injuries. Passenger compartment intact but rear window broken. Vehicle's trunk found open and empty upon officers' arrival. In an interview for the Springfield newsletter that followed on July 22, 1961, Davidson provided further information. It wasn't a deer or any animal I could identify. It appeared to be a person, standing perfectly still in the center of the road. As we approached, it didn't move or respond to the headlights. I swerved at the last moment and lost control. The strangest thing was the silence afterward. No crickets, no night birds, complete stillness, and the feeling of being watched from the tree line. My assistant, James Woodson, insisted we leave immediately, even though we knew the artifacts were scattered somewhere in the underbrush. Historians and folklorists researching Ozark history occasionally focused on the Crenshaw enigma in the decades after Davidson's discovery. From the ordinary to the extraordinary, a variety of explanations surfaced. Some said that Thomas Crenshaw's abrupt escape from punishment was necessary because he had engaged in counterfeiting or other illegal acts. According to others, the family had encountered early vigilante organizations that were active in the lawless frontier areas. An unexpected source in 1963 provided some credence for the counterfeiting theory. Coins discovered in a wall cavity during renovations at the former Forsyth General Store. In his analysis of the coins at the request of the County Historical Society, metallurgist Stephen Clark wrote, "The 17 silver dollars discovered appear to be counterfeit, though of exceptionally high quality. They bear dates between 1842 and 1845, and show signs of having been crafted by someone with considerable skill in metalwork. The maker possessed knowledge beyond that of a typical frontier counterfeiter." County tax records from 1844 to 1846 show that Thomas Crenshaw made multiple purchases of metals and tools that might be used in the cold counterfeiting operations. While Crenshaw certainly possessed the technical skills to produce counterfeit coins, this theory fails to explain the more unusual aspects of the case, particularly the ritualistic arrangements of objects found in the cave and the cryptic references in Margaret's journal, noted local historian Martha Wilkins in her 1964 analysis of the case. A more complex theory was presented by Dr. Eleanor Pruitt, professor of anthropology at the University of Missouri, in her 1965 paper, Isolation and Psychosis in Frontier Communities. Pruitt proposed that the Crenshaw case was an instance of shared psychosis made worse by the isolation of frontier life. The journal entries of Margaret Crenshaw reveal a progressive detachment from reality, Pruitt stated. References to being watched, to mysterious forces, these are consistent with paranoid delusions. In close-knit family units existing in extreme isolation, such delusions can be transmitted between members, creating a shared alternate reality. Although Pruitt's theory received scholarly backing, it was unable to explain other aspects, most notably the buried artifacts found in 1934 and the items piled in the cave that Davidson's team had photographed. If the Crenshaws had simply fled due to shared delusions, who had placed these items and for what purpose? While I maintain that shared psychosis offers the most plausible explanation for the family's behavior and eventual flight, I must concede that certain physical evidence suggests a more complex situation. Pruitt acknowledged these contradictions in a rarely cited addendum to her original paper, which was published in a 1966 issue of the Journal of Frontier Psychology. The arrangement of artifacts in the cave, in particular, indicates deliberate, ritualistic activity that persisted beyond the family's disappearance, which suggests either that Thomas Crenshaw returned to the site at some point or that others were involved in whatever activities transpired there. The descendants of Dr. Samuel Reed, who had been the only doctor in the area in the 1842, gave a collection of letters to the Taney County Historical Society in 1967, providing a partial response. One letter from Reed's correspondence was from September 1846, around 2 months prior to the Crenshaw abduction. It detailed Reed's treatment of young Daniel Crenshaw's hand injury. The boy's wounds were consistent with defensive injuries, Reed wrote to a colleague in Street. Louis, though both father and son insisted they resulted from an accident with a hunting knife. More troubling than the physical wounds was the boy's manner. He spoke not a word during treatment and flinched from his father's touch. When asked directly how the injury occurred, he merely stared at the floor and trembled. I have seen such behavior before in those who have witnessed things they cannot speak of. Reed's letter continues. The father, Thomas, bears watching. There is a coldness in his eyes that disturbs me greatly. When I suggested the boy remain overnight for observation, Thomas refused with unexpected vehemence. Before departing, the boy whispered something that I could not fully discern, but which sounded like, he takes them to the dark place. When pressed, he would say, "No more." A second letter from Reed's collection, dated October 1846, more details. Encountered Margaret Crenshaw in town yesterday. The woman appears considerably aged since spring, her hair showing gray, her movements those of someone much older. When I inquired after her health, she spoke in circles, eventually conveying that she has difficulty sleeping due to the voices in the walls. I suggested a tonic for nerves, but she declined, stating that medicine cannot silence what comes from beyond the ridge. Her eldest daughter, Abigail, stood silently throughout our conversation, her gaze fixed on some distant point. The girl's complexion was ashen, her eyes underscored by dark circles suggesting prolonged sleep deprivation. This paper raised a more concerning aspect of the Crenshaw case, the potential that Thomas Crenshaw was involved in violent, or at least frightening behaviors that frightened his own son. Is the cave that Davidson later found the dark place that Daniel mentioned? What function did it fulfill in Thomas Crenshaw's life, if any? In 1968, there was a growing body of evidence that suggested Thomas Crenshaw might have been involved in troubling actions. The 1,840 death records from Taney County were analyzed by historian James Woodson, who had been with Davidson on the cave excursion 7 years prior. Woodson noticed an odd trend. 7 recorded cases of passengers reported missing along the Springfield-Forsyth Road occurred between 1,843 and 1,846 when the Crenshaws lived in the area. The frequency is statistically unusual for a relatively established area, even though such disappearances were not unusual in frontier regions. What is more noteworthy is that the missing person was reported as traveling alone in each case, and in 5 cases, they were defined as itinerant workers or peddlers, whose prolonged absence may not instantly raise concerns. Woodson noted that correlation does not imply causality and refrained from immediately linking Thomas Crenshaw to these disappearances. He did note, however, that in November 1846, the same month the Crenshaw family disappeared, the reported disappearances stopped. The setting of the Crenshaw drama was irrevocably changed in 1968 when Table Rock Dam was built and parts of the White River Valley were flooded. The cave that Davidson recorded was probably part of the partially submerged Bull Creek Ridge, also known to the early settlers as Sampson's Ridge. The already limited tangible evidence was no longer available for additional research. The Army Corps of Engineers conducted a final expedition to the cave as part of their environmental impact assessment prior to the flooding. Cave location, consistent with Davidson's 1,961 documentation. Chamber dimensions verified. Wall markings photographed. C. Appendix C. No artifacts present in the described alcove or elsewhere in the chamber. Evidence of recent human activity. Cigarette butts. Food wrappers. Acoustic properties noted by previous researchers confirmed. The chamber exhibits unusual sound characteristics that engineering team attributes to the specific curvature of the limestone walls and the narrowness of the entrance passage. The report's referenced photographs, which should have been included in Appendix C, are oddly missing from all official copies. In 1972, Corps spokesperson Robert Martindale was asked about this disparity and only replied that some documentation from the Table Rock project has been misplaced due to departmental reorganization. In 1969, the Crenshaw puzzle's last piece appeared. A group of records that had been sealed inside a wall cavity, most likely during repairs after a fire in 1865, were discovered during renovations at the old county courthouse in Forsyth. A statement from William Harper, who had been Sheriff Kenny's deputy during the first Crenshaw inquiry, was one of these documents. A troubling story can be found in Harper's statement, which was dated December 1846, but was reportedly never formally filed. What the sheriff excluded from his report was the condition of the shed behind the Crenshaw home. The earthen floor had been recently disturbed and resettled. Upon digging, we discovered animal remains, primarily small rodents and birds, but also what Dr. Reed identified as the partial skeleton of a fox. The bones had been arranged in a pattern similar to a human form. Most had been stripped clean of flesh by means Dr. Reed could not determine. Harper goes on, more disturbing was the discovery of a small leather pouch containing human teeth, at least 7, according to Dr. Reed's count. Their size suggested they came from children. No record exists of any children gone missing in the county, but travel through these hills is common, and not all travelers are accounted for. The statement contains information that was not included in Sheriff Kenny's report, such as, in the root cellar beneath the cabin's main room, we discovered a collection of small shoes, at least 9 pairs of varying sizes. None appeared to belong to the Crenshaw children, being either too small or of inappropriate style. Each had been carefully cleaned and arranged in a semicircle facing the eastern wall. When questioned, the neighbors could recall no visitors with children staying at the Crenshaw home. Dr. Reed noted that several pairs showed signs of extended wear, suggesting they had not been newly acquired. Harper's account ends with a private comment. I have served the law in these hills for 14 years and have witnessed acts of terrible violence, born of desperation, greed, and hatred. What I sensed in that shed was different, a coldness that went beyond human malice. The sheriff instructed me to replace the earth and speak of this to no one. He feared panic in the settlement. I comply with his wishes, but record this account for posterity. Some truths, however terrible, should not be lost to time. After Harper's statement was found, the historical haze surrounding the Crenshaw disappearance started to give way to the beginnings of a darker story. Thomas Crenshaw, a fairly unremarkable cobbler, seemed to have been involved in unsettling activities, such as ceremonial animal deaths, and possibly more. With its organized artifacts and engraved inscriptions, the cave on Sampson's Ridge implied a significant location for these activities. However, what happened to the Crenshaws? Even if the evidence is shaky, it suggests that they fled their homestead quickly, possibly when Margaret realized what her husband was really up to. They intended to head north into the territories, according to the letter discovered buried with Thomas's pocket watch. However, there is no evidence that the family moved elsewhere. No death certificates, land sales, or census data for any Crenshaw family member after November 1846 have ever been found. The discovery of a brief mention of a T. Crenshaw in an 1847 ledger from a trading post close to what is now Leavenworth, Kansas, by historian Arthur Pendleton in 1951 while studying frontier movement patterns at the Kansas Historical Society provided a tantalizing hint. In a footnote to his study on westward migration, Pendleton mentioned the coincidence but did not follow up on it. The entry, dated February 12, 1847, states, simply sold to T. Crenshaw, 2 wool blankets, 10 pounds, flour, 1 hunting knife, ammunition, paid with silver coins of unusual make. A land claim for 160 acres close to the Columbia River that was submitted in the Washington Territory, now in Oregon, in 1848, and signed by a Thomas C., was found in 1953. This signature resembles that of Thomas Crenshaw's initial Taney County land purchase, according to local historian Evelyn Marsh, who discovered the document while studying early settlements. However, since no later papers mention the property being constructed or inhabited, it appears that the claim was dropped after it was first filed. The Crenshaw story's last chapter might have been written in 1952 after Clara Wilson, an elderly woman, passed away in a Tulsa, Oklahoma nursing home. A little leather-bound Bible bearing the name Margaret Crenshaw on the flyleaf was one of her personal belongings. When asked about her early years, Wilson would reportedly become irritated and repeat the line, "Father did what the darkness asked until Mother made us run." Nursing home personnel said Wilson rarely spoke, but occasionally referenced growing up in the shadow of evil. Mrs. Wilson was prone to nightmares that would leave her screaming about the man with no face and the circle in the stone. On several occasions, she became so distressed that sedation was necessary. On calmer occasions, she would sometimes speak of a journey through wilderness as a small child, traveling by night and hiding during the day. According to a statement given to the Tulsa World newspaper after Wilson's death by her nurse, Beatrice Holderman, who cared for her in her last years, there was no conclusive evidence to support the claim that Clara Wilson was indeed Clara Crenshaw. Wilson left no surviving offspring to offer DNA for comparison. and birth records from the frontier in the 1,840 seconds are infamously lacking. She would have been a baby when the family vanished, too young to have trustworthy recollections of what happened, if she was the youngest Crenshaw kid. As she grew older, did her mother or siblings tell her stories that might have inspired her cryptic statements? A number of artifacts that might have been relevant to the Crenshaw case were among Wilson's personal belongings. One of these was a 6-inch tall hand-carved wooden figure that showed a human figure with a face devoid of features and without expression. The arms of the figure were longer than they should have been. Among Wilson's belongings was a journal with mostly blank pages save for a sequence of entries from 1925 to 1927, and the initials TC etched in rough letters on its base. A sequence of dreams or visions are recorded in the shaky and frequently unintelligible handwriting. Saw him again last night, standing at the foot of my bed. He still has no face, but I know he's smiling. He wants me to remember the words, but I cannot, will not. Mother said to forget, and I have tried, but he finds me in dreams, always saying the same thing. The circle remains unbroken. Today, the Crenshaw homestead is located beneath Table Rock Lake's waters. The stone foundation of the cottage occasionally rises momentarily from its watery tomb during dry spells, when the water level falls considerably, a fleeting reminder of the family whose fate is still unknown. Local fisherman Harold Jenkins reported an extraordinary discovery in the summer of 1964 after a particularly bad drought. There was something carved into one of the larger stones on what would have been the eastern wall, Jenkins told the Branson Daily News when the foundation stones were revealed. A circle with strange symbols around it. Reminded me of those pictures of Davidson's cave drawings that were in the paper a few years back. Gave me an uneasy feeling, like I was looking at something I wasn't meant to see. The coves close to where Sampson's Ridge drops into the lake are occasionally described by tourists as being unusually quiet. Park officials dismiss such chatter as superstition, pointing out that water quality testing reveal nothing odd in the area, while fishermen avoid these waterways because they say the fish taste wrong. However, the tales endure, having been handed down through Ozark family generations. They talk about a presence that waits and observes, something that lurks in some isolated hollows. Something that sometimes still beckons to people who stray too far from the designated pathways, according to local legend. In a 1977 oral history project, Blinda Carver, whose family has been in the area since the 1,830 seconds, related one such story. My grandfather used to say that when the moon is dark, you can sometimes hear singing coming from beneath the water where the old Crenshaw place used to be. Not like regular singing, more like chanting in a language that isn't any he ever heard. He said his father told him it was the voice of something that lived in the hills long before white folks came, something that found a willing servant in Thomas Crenshaw. I keep coming back to the question, why did Thomas Crenshaw bury that last message? Who did he think would find it, and why warn them that the discovery would alert it, whatever it might be? These are the questions that wake me in the night. These are the questions that draw me back to that ridge, even as reason tells me to stay away, wrote historian Emmett Davidson in his personal journal in 1963. Davidson had led the expedition to the cave 5 years earlier. The Missouri State Historical Society purchased Davidson's journal after his death, and it includes progressively troubling entries in the months before his deadly heart attack. The 10th of June, 1966. Dreamed of the cave again last night. In the dream, the symbols on the wall were moving, rearranging themselves, and something was emerging from the alcove. Something that wore a human shape but moved all wrong. It had Thomas Crenshaw's face, but the eyes were empty. It spoke to me in the dream, asking why I had disturbed the circle. I awoke drenched in sweat, the room unnaturally cold despite the summer heat. 3 years after writing those first reflections, Davidson died of a heart attack the next day. His final entry, dated July 28, 1966, reads simply, "It knows I'm looking for it. I can feel its attention turning toward me. I will go to the ridge one last time tomorrow to see if the water has revealed the entrance again. If I do not return, let this record stand as warning. Some secrets are buried for a reason." less than a mile from where the Crenshaw property had been before the rising waters took it. His body was found on a hiking route. Davidson's face was locked in a mask of great fright, the medical examiner's report said. Natural causes were stated as the official cause of death. Emmett became obsessed with the Crenshaw mystery in his final years. He was convinced there was some crucial piece of evidence we had overlooked, something that would explain what Thomas Crenshaw had been involved in. In a 1969 interview with the Springfield News Leader, James Woodson, who had accompanied Davidson on the original cave expedition and later published his own analysis of the case, shared this reflection. Emmett began researching obscure religious practices, folk magic traditions, even prehistoric cults that might have existed in the Ozarks. His office walls were covered with maps and timelines. He stopped teaching, stopped publishing. The Crenshaw case consumed him. The mystery surrounding the Crenshaw family is more than just a historical interest. It provides an insight into the more sinister facets of frontier existence, such as the loneliness that has the potential to distort human perception and the secrets that may fester in isolated cabins away from society's moderating influence. It serves as a reminder that underneath the glorious tale of American westward expansion is another tale of helpless people lost in a vast and uncaring wilderness, where the distinction between sanity and insanity may become hazy like dawn. Mist over the Ozark Hills. Victor Rasmussen, a cultural anthropologist, coined the term the Crenshaw syndrome in 1958 to characterize a specific type of psychosis that can arise in remote homesteading settings. This syndrome is typified by ritualistic behavior, paranoid delusions, and the creation of personal mythologies to explain natural phenomena. Rasmussen listed a number of other frontier America cases that, in his opinion, showed comparable trends, but none of them had the unusual tangible proof that sets the Crenshaw case apart. The real tragedy of the Crenshaw case could not be in what we now know, but rather in what we will never fully comprehend. Some things cannot be described, must not be described. Some riddles are best left unsolved, and some doors are better kept closed, as Margaret wrote in her last diary entry. Because in his last frantic letter, Thomas Crenshaw cautioned, "If you are reading this, the jar has been disturbed, and it will know. It always knows." A circle of tiny items, including buttons, thimbles, a child's teeth, and a locket with a curl of black hair, may still be resting on a limestone ledge somewhere beneath the shadowy waters of Table Rock Lake, in a cave that is now only open to fish and the rare diver. A cobbler's knife, its blade tarnished with time and mysteries that the seas will never reveal, sits in the middle. I told them about the crying I heard that night, but not about what I saw 2 days later. A figure moving through the trees at dusk, carrying something in his arms. I thought it was Thomas with a deer carcass. Only it moved wrong, too stiff, like it was struggling to remember how a man should walk. And what it carried wasn't a deer. It was too small, too still. I've carried that sight with me for 26 years. I tell you now so I might die with a cleaner soul. This is a statement made by Jeremiah Branson, the Crenshaw's closest neighbor, just before his death in 1872. The thing I saw moving through the trees that evening, I called it a man, because it walked on 2 legs. But something wasn't right about it. The proportions were wrong. Arms too long, head set too far forward on the shoulders. And though I couldn't see its face clearly in the dusk, I had the distinct impression it was watching me even as it moved away from my property line, watching without eyes, if such a thing is possible to imagine. Branson explained in a deposition he gave to local historian Evelyn Marsh in 1871, but was not found among her papers until 1973. Diver Richard Loomis reported an odd discovery on the submerged portion of Bull Creek Ridge in 1965, while the Missouri Department of Conservation was conducting an underwater study of Table Rock Lake. "We found what looked like the entrance to a cave or fissure in the limestone at a depth of about 40 feet, Loomis wrote in his official report. A follow-up expedition was planned, but never carried out, because department priorities shifted to other projects. The opening was partially obscured by silt, but distinctly visible. As we approached, we experienced an unexpected water temperature drop of approximately 15 degrees Fahrenheit. More unusual was the behavior of our compass, which began spinning erratically. In 30 years of diving, I've never experienced anything like that temperature change or compass malfunction. It wasn't mechanical failure. Both of our instruments were affected simultaneously. Something about that location disrupted the magnetic field. "I've always regretted not going back to investigate further," Loomis said in an interview for a retrospective article in 1987, expressing his ongoing perplexity over the incident. As the seasons change, Table Rock Lake's waters rise and decrease. Visitors arrive and depart. However, beneath the surface, the Crenshaw cabin's foundations are still there, stone upon stone, silently bearing witness to a family that disappeared into the horror and the past. And maybe, in the darkest hours of the night, when the lake is motionless as glass under the moon, something beneath those waters is still moving. Something that recalls the taste of fear, the sound of a woman's cries, and the gentle footsteps of a cobbler moving along a ridge to satisfy an old hunger. When the Taney County Historical Museum was being renovated in 1992, a curator found a small wooden box concealed in a wall hole. One page, torn from what seemed like a child's journal, was within. The handwriting was childlike, but readable, yellowed with age, signed Abigail C., and dated the 17th of October, 1846. Little than a month before the family vanished. "Father took me to the cave again today," he said. "I am old enough now to learn the words, the ones that make the shadows in the corner move. He says there is power in speaking them, but only if you truly believe. I do not want to believe. I do not want to see what comes when he speaks into the dark. But Father says we must all serve it, that it was here before us and will be here after, that it keeps us safe if we give it what it wants. Mother suspects something. I saw her watching from the trees as we returned. Her face was white as winter. Tonight she asked me where we go on these walks. I said nothing, as Father instructed. But I wanted to warn her, to tell her not to look for us, not to follow, not to see what waits in the circle of stones." Perhaps the most direct account of the activities at the cave from a member of the Crenshaw family, this delicate document is now kept in an acid-free case in the museum's climate-controlled archive. Some historians have questioned its veracity, especially considering that it was conveniently discovered about 150 years after the events it claims to recount. Although the paper and ink were found to be comparable with materials available in the 1842, a 1994 handwriting examination was inconclusive. The paper highlights the Crenshaw mystery's persistent ability to pique people's interest, regardless of whether it is a genuine or complex fabrication. Like all great historical mysteries, it provides just enough substantiated information to support conjecture, while also allowing enough room for the imagination to conjure up more sinister alternatives. Ultimately, the Crenshaw family is left behind in the form of shards rather than bodies or graves, diary entries, strewn items, first-hand recollections, and the enduring rumors of local mythology. Based on these pieces, we try to piece together a story that explains why they vanished, that turns chance into purposeful pattern. By placing items in circles, engraving symbols into stone, and looking for significance in the shadows that assemble at the boundaries of comprehension, we might be echoing Thomas Crenshaw himself. And maybe something is keeping an eye on us, something that lurks in the emptiness between ideas, something that is always aware of any disturbances to the jar.